Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into an incredibly fascinating and honestly pretty complex legal rebuttal today. We're looking at a case involving a community known as Lifechanyuan and its second home living arrangement. On one side, we have an indictment making some really severe accusations about the group's practices, and on the other, a meticulously detailed defense citing internal documents to argue this is fundamentally a misunderstanding of constitutional freedoms. It is a classic clash between strict legal definitions and alternative lifestyles, and we're going to break down exactly what the source material says. Let's anchor ourselves right off the bat with this really powerful quote directly from the defense's rebuttal. This statement perfectly highlights the fundamental friction at the heart of this entire legal debate. You see, the defense argues that the prosecution is taking philosophical concepts and alternative, voluntary ways of living and basically packaging them as criminal acts. They claim it's a case of presumption of guilt based purely on a disagreement with a lifestyle, rather than any actual measurable harm. To clearly understand the massive gap between the prosecution's claims and the defense's cited evidence, we're going to methodically break down the source material through these 5 themes: core charges, truth of family and marriage, admission and internal titles, nude photos and faith freedom, and finally, legal and ethical boundaries. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, core charges and rebuttals, understanding the stakes. Let's lay out the foundational arguments so we know exactly what's on the line here. The prosecution essentially paints a picture of a heavily controlled environment. They allege that the community operates under strict personal control, demands the severance of family and marital ties, and encourages behaviors that violate societal ethics, all masked as a spiritual pursuit. Now, the defense counters these charges point by point, arguing that these are actually entirely voluntary lifestyle choices protected by constitutional freedoms of speech and belief. Moving right along to Section 2, Truth of Family and Marriage, where we'll be deconstructing some of the most emotional accusations in the indictment. This is where things get really interesting. The prosecution claims that once someone enters the second home, their ties to their parents, siblings, and children are automatically severed. But the defense, they call this a total fabrication. They cite their own internal rules, which establish that fulfilling your earthly family duties is actually a strict prerequisite for even being considered for admission in the first place. So, did the group actually force families to separate? Well, to answer this objectively, the defense doesn't just offer an opinion. They point straight to their own 2011 internal document, which is appropriately titled, How to Escape Family Predicaments. Let's look at what that document actually says. So the crucial point here is that instead of severing ties, the defense's own literature explicitly bars entry to anyone who abandons their filial duties. The text clearly states that if a person has elderly parents to support or underage kids to raise, they can't just ditch them to pursue a spiritual life. In fact, doing so is labeled as lacking virtue, and those individuals are outright rejected from joining the community. Furthermore, the defense backs this up with demographic data from inside the second home to directly challenge the claim of forced separation. The rules explicitly allow non-member relatives to visit and stay for free. Even more telling, they document that entire families frequently move in together. The defense points to examples of households with up to 10 members. We're talking grandparents, parents, and children, 3 generations living together inside the community. Think about your own family for a second. How can a 3-generational household living together possibly be considered dissolving a family? Which brings us to the topic of marriage. The prosecution claims marriages are completely dissolved. The defense explains that, sure, internal relationship dynamics do shift, moving away from traditional concepts of ownership toward a more platonic mutual respect, but legally, the marital status is fully preserved. Actually, a married person can't even get in without the explicit written consent of their spouse. The defense frames this as a lawful adult choice to adjust relationship dynamics, not the destruction of a legal marriage. Okay, Section 3, Admission and Internal Titles, Autonomy versus Control. Let's examine the friction between perceived institutional control and voluntary participation. The prosecution views the requirement of the founder's approval for entry as evidence of intense personal control, but the defense pushes back hard, arguing that, hey, practically any organization has an admissions process, right? They note that requiring 6 months of tenure, active communication, and proven contribution to the community is just a standardized objective threshold. They compare it to a university admissions process requiring a principal's signature or a corporate job needing HR approval. And to really hammer home this idea of autonomy, the defense quotes the community's own second home life procedures. While getting in has strict conditions, leaving is completely unconditional. Not only are there zero obstacles to leaving, but the community literally pays your travel expenses to go. As the defense argues, an institution that hands you a free bus ticket out the door is the exact opposite of one exerting extreme personal control. Then there's the practice of giving members internal names, referred to as grass names. The prosecution sees this as a manipulative tool to erase a person's outside identity. The defense, however, contextualizes this as a super standard spiritual tradition. They argue it's honestly no different than a Buddhist monk taking a Dharma name or a Christian taking a baptismal name. It's a spiritual reframing, not a literal severing of familial bonds or who you are. Moving to Section 4, Nude Photos and Faith Freedom. Here we're diving into philosophy, ethics, and the law. Now we have to address what are undoubtedly the most provocative claims in the indictment. The prosecution says the group encouraged posting nude photos, framing this as a severe moral violation. But the defense clarifies the highly specific context here. It was strictly limited to a private, non-public internal website and was only suggested for adult members who'd been in the community for over 10 years. They frame it not as public obscenity, but as a voluntary exercise designed to help members overcome psychological shame and embrace a natural state. Legally, the defense draws a firm and crucial line here between suggestion and coercion. The Penal Code punishes forcing someone to do something against their will. The defense argues that suggesting a consenting adult try a vulnerable spiritual practice in a private setting is fundamentally different from coercion. It's kind of like a psychotherapist suggesting exposure therapy. It's advice within a specific professional framework, not a criminal mandate. Plus, under the law, private sharing of images among consenting adults just doesn't meet the legal threshold for obscenity. And this is wild. It's amazing how something as simple as punctuation completely changes the legal context. The indictment actually uses quotation marks around the terms no self and formless, heavily implying these are fabricated, cult-like terms used to manipulate people. The defense aggressively counters this by pointing out that these are literally foundational historical doctrines of Buddhism. By mocking these terms with quotes, the defense argues the prosecution is improperly judging religious philosophy, which violates the constitutional right to freedom of belief. Finally, Section 5, Legal and Ethical Boundaries, the final analysis. Let's zoom out to see how the defense separates subjective morality from the strict letter of the law. The prosecution leans really heavily on the argument that the community's lifestyle violates ethics and morality. But the defense points out a pretty undeniable legal reality. Violating ethics simply isn't a crime listed in the Penal Code. Ethical standards fluctuate wildly across different cultures and eras. Just think about traditional rules against traveling far from your parents versus modern mobile work habits. The defense stresses that courts absolutely must judge citizens based strictly on legal violations, not on moral disagreements with their chosen lifestyle. Take a look at this summary table, because it beautifully synthesizes our entire explainer. It maps out exactly how the defense legally categorizes every single one of the prosecution's points. Where the prosecution sees family dissolution, the defense provides evidence to label it a false accusation. Where the prosecution sees marriage dissolved, the defense legally categorizes it as a lawful adult choice. They take each moral or emotional charge and methodically recategorize it under a specific legal defense, ranging from freedom of faith to straight up not a crime. So we're going to leave you with this final, provocative question drawn straight from the source material. When a community's private, voluntary practices clash with mainstream societal norms, where exactly do we draw the line? Should the justice system focus strictly on measurable actions and harmful consequences? Or does it have a mandate to police thoughts, philosophies, and unconventional lifestyles? It's a huge question about the limits of law and personal freedom. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this explainer. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.